investigated. Now, that's one thing to tell me that in a private conversation. It's quite another thing for a forensic pathologist to write that in a report. And what Dr. Jaffe wrote in his report was, he said, the question arises whether such an incomplete examination of a forensic case, one liable to go to court, conforms to the reasonably expected standards of a government institution devoted to the study of medical forensics. That's a really condemning statement that's made by someone who is working within the system. Dr. Jaffe wasn't the only one that said that. We also hired Dr. King from Hamilton, who's a forensic pathologist, and Dr. King said in his report, it looks as though they are trying to prove their conclusion before they've collected the right information. We then hired a series of private investigators, and we've hired lawyers, and you know, I won't go into that. But yes, we did have expert opinion, we did have expert help, and of course I think there's been a culmination of things that have gone through the years. Scott Newark's report, when he was the vice chair and special counsel for the Office of Victims of Crime, wrote a definitive report that said, reopen this case and assign it to homicide. It's hard to believe that that could get ignored by police and coroners. So, you know, Andrew would know that, you know, when the Fifth Estate program came out, somebody said to me the other day, they said, well, we thought when the Fifth Estate program aired that somebody would look at that and do something. But in fact, the opposite was true. We were just met with this even more silence than in the past. So, you know, media coverage certainly puts the case out in the front, but it doesn't mean that the people in positions of responsibility, in this case, it falls squarely on the shoulders of the Chief Coroner of Ontario. And the Chief Coroner of Ontario, you know, let me give you the background, the recent background. So, April the 9th, 2009, we attended a Health Profession Appeal and Review Board hearing, and the lawyers for the coroner's office stood up and said in the hearing, we don't have the death investigation file from the 9th of December into January 2002. It's missing. So there's a whole bunch of things that are missing. So immediately we called the Chief Coroner of Ontario, who's Dr. McCallum, and Dr. McCallum's issues manager said to me on the phone, Dr. McCallum will never meet with you. And then we received a letter from Dr. McCallum that said, no, I'm not going to meet with you to discuss your son's case. Now, this is a pretty serious allegation. The original file is missing. The certificate of death is missing. You know, you either have a Chief Coroner who does his job, or you get a Chief Coroner who will do his job. I would suggest quite strongly there's a lot of pressure on Dr. McCallum right now to do his job. Of course, there's been a lot of pressure on a series of Chief Coroners in Ontario over the past, I would say, decades. Unfortunately, Ontario has not been served well by its Chief Coroners, and I think most people in the media understand what I'm talking about.
So, based on, so go ahead.
Aside from all of the things that you're suggesting were technical mistakes, what do you and your family think actually happened?
You know, what you have to do in this case, because I'm not the investigating officer and I'm not the Chief Coroner, what I could do is I can provide all the evidence that I have. I can give you all the leads of where it's going to go. I can tell you who's got access to John's apartment. I can tell you who's been in John's apartment. I can tell you why they shouldn't be there. But until you actually have an investigation that's conducted by the authorities, it's not really my position to speculate on that. As I said, I don't want to make the same mistake that the Chief Coroner and the police made on December the 9th, 2001. We need a proper investigation here.
Well, without speculating on that, based on the evidence from all the people you just mentioned, the private investigations, and I think you mentioned earlier, you used the word homicide. Based on all that, do you then have a picture of what happened to John that is different from what the coroner's office, you know, how much does that differ from what the coroner's office is saying?
The information that's available, first of all, is entirely different. The coroner's office doesn't even discuss the suspicious injuries. You know, let me just give you one example of the evidence. So there's you know, John's found flat on his back at the base of a building. And Dr. Jaffe has documented a skull fracture from the photographs. Now, The coroner's office didn't document that skull fracture. So the coroner's office has a choice. They can either take another look at the photograph and say, yes, that's a skull fracture, or no, we're not sure that's a skull fracture. But if it's a skull fracture, it will be there for 100 years. So if they're really interested in doing this investigation and they're not sure that's a skull fracture, they have to do an exhumation. Second example, the coroner's office never did a full document analysis on the note that was left in John's apartment. We have 2 forensic handwriting document analyses that were done on that note, and they both say that the word "to" doesn't match any of John's known handwriting. If the word "to" is in a position where it changes the direction and the meaning of the note, then it becomes a very high probability that that's a forgery. If the Office of the Chief Coroner is serious about examining the evidence, you would think they would take that note over to the Center for Forensic Science and ask Greg Boyd to do a full document analysis on the note. That's never been done. That's actually quite inexpensive to do. So those are just 2 examples of, does our information differ from the coroner's information? Yes, it does.
As a father and as a sister, emotionally though, something has to tell you. My son.
Well, we knew right away. We knew absolutely right away that,
John, you had to meet him, but he really wasn't a person who would ever harm himself, ever. It wasn't in him. It just wasn't in him.
One of John's friends said it correctly. She said, John would never put his family through this. John would just never put his family through this. That's just the way John was.
But when it comes to the emotional aspect of us being here today, you also have to remember that at the heart of it, we are scientists. And this is what we do on a day-to-day basis. We have a problem, we gather evidence, and we come to conclusions. So when you sit and you ask us, what do you think? We have a large problem. We have evidence, but we haven't worked with the authorities who also have evidence. And they didn't do a real investigation. They didn't do a forensic autopsy. They did an external autopsy. So there are answers that we don't have. And with our background, being scientists, we don't make a conclusion or speculate. We do it once we have everything.
Can I ask just one definite last question from me? I'm sorry. The Coroners Act, or the legislation governing coroners, has recently been substantially overhauled because of great imperfections. And this case has gone on, dragged on, some might say, for many years. Is there anything in the changes to the law governing coroners recently passed, those changes, which I don't remember precisely, which give you more optimism or a better opportunity of seeing this case gets a fair hearing?
We're very familiar with the Coroners Act of Ontario, Gloria and I and Sarah. The Coroners Act of Ontario is actually a really well-written piece of legislation. The issue we have is that the Coroners Act of Ontario has really not been enforced and continues not to be enforced. The Coroners Act of Ontario is quite precise on what should be done. I could make a comment here, and that is that the only flaw in it may be that the people who penned that legislation probably never envisioned that the people who would be breaching the Coroners Act of Ontario would in fact be coroners or police officers.
But didn't the imperfections send a man to jail for life? Was his name Mullins, as I remember?
Yeah, but I think if you went back to the Coroners Act and you looked at what was supposed to be done, I think if you looked at the Coroners Act and what was supposed to be done, I didn't spend a lot of time on the Coroners Act of Ontario, but the Coroners Act of Ontario, if it's followed as a piece of legislation, is actually well written. And in our defense here, and what we're putting forward is, you didn't follow the Coroners Act of Ontario, Dr. Young. That's what we're saying.
I should have looked up before I came here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it from the media. I do. I appreciate it.